Maybe you do. Maybe you find it a bit more interesting. Right, so here we are. Can you all see that? Hopefully you can see that. You'll tell me if you can't see that, I'm sure. Thank you. I've got a few thumbs up, so hopefully that's a go. So handhelds, pros and cons. I just thought I would go through some sort of pros and cons, really, of the handheld world, as it were. And as I said already, you know, this does tend to be the way into the hobby for a lot of people. Although before I move on to the next slide, the history behind handheld actually goes back a long, long time. And those of us that can remember the sort of late 70s, early 80s will probably remember the handheld CB radio bricks that were about that high and antennas that were so long. Probably more popular back then, and then quite often the sets, the home-based sets themselves, because it was quite easy to get hold of and quite easy to use. So a lot of that equipment is still around. In fact, I've got one somewhere kicking around. So the history of handhelds goes back a great long way. The other interesting fact, I was trying to find out some facts about mobiles. For most manufacturers these days, certainly the more popular brands, Yaesu and the like, well over 100 and I think 150 plus different types of handheld available, different models, different makes, different functions. It's an incredible explosion of equipment, and a lot of this equipment is easily accessible, easily and widely available, and quite cheap to buy. You know, I sort of gave up with trying to delve into all of that, because I thought, you know, it would just take far too long, just sort of, you know, looking at those different aspects. But what I thought I would just do is give you a quick overview, or not quick, but an overview of some of my thoughts about the pros and cons, having used some of those models. There are just so many on the market, and I'm talking to the converted when I said that, because most of you will know a lot about those anyway. So here we go. So a bit of a beginner's guide really to like ours, or they get into the hobby, and the first place they go is their handheld, and they can use a handheld even before they have a license, because obviously they can be a shortwave listener, and it's generally an easy tool to work your way around. But the reason why I put this little slide together was because I can remember, certainly my old club, getting asked these questions by shortwave listeners. What's the best handheld? You know, what's the best way of going about getting a handheld? And I can remember going through some of these things with them. So this would be my advice, really. So let's just go through very, very quickly each one of these. The mode, really, what mode you want to operate on, the frequency range you're looking to operate over, because a lot of the modern handhelds now aren't limited to just narrow frequencies now. Most are wide-banded, most can cope with almost the same number of frequencies available to you as you would have on a home-based rig. So and expensive, a lot of them as well. So the frequency ranges are massive. Your operating characteristics, you know, where do you intend to operate this, and so on and so forth, and whether it's analog or digital, because a lot of the newer makes, certainly quite recently, a lot of suppliers of equipment have come out now with some really sophisticated digital capability within your standard handheld radio. You know, I'm talking radios that sort of size, pocket size, or maybe just slightly bigger than pocket size. So I would start by giving that little bit of advice and actually read the reviews. One of the things I did was I sort of, before I decided on my very first little handheld, I, in fact, and I've got it here somewhere, up in the window somewhere, yeah. I did go and read some reviews from other hams, although even at the time I can remember reading them, I wasn't actually licensed at that point, but I still went and read them to just get a sense of what I was, you know, what's available, what's out there. I then sort of go on and talk about the application, where you intend to use it, where you're located, where you're going to be using it. And I still get, you know, you still come across people who don't necessarily think about location at all. They might choose a handheld because of some of the functionality of it suits their needs, but actually in terms of where they're going to try locating it or using it in location, it's not the best fit. So location, shape, size, I know that might sound obvious, but actually if you're going to be doing, like, for example, with SOTA work, if you're going to be doing lots of outdoor, well, not outdoor, but lots of field events and remote activity, then, you know, the shape and the size of it does make a difference, even though it's a handheld. I know that might sound odd, but it is. And I know, and I'm sure you're the same, I know loads of hams who take 4 or 5 handhelds with them at once, and they could be, you know, that could be a bit of a weight going on there. So you've got to kind of look at that. You've got to decide whether you're actually going to be using it on the move, whether you're mobile. I don't know for sure if you guys are aware of sort of radio direction finding or amateur radio direction finding, but there's if you look at that particular part of the hobby, and I used to be, I'm not so much now, but I used to be quite interested in that. I'm still interested in radio direction finding, but there's certainly one group who've taken that a step further, in fact, and they're now involved in things like, you know, running and marathons and all sorts of stuff like that, where you know, radio operators run from point to point to collect various things along the way, and so on and so forth. And so they're not just using their radios mobile, but they're actually using them whilst running. So, you know, they've got all sorts of considerations that your average, you know, ham using their handy out in a field trip or something isn't going to have that need. So looking at the mobile situation, what you're going to do with it and so on, yeah, it's quite important. And the other thing is connectivity, actually where you are, what you need to connect to. And I was thinking more there, if you do decide to go digital, are you going to be able to get enough connectivity for your radio to be activated in the hotspot that you're in? Because if you're not, you've just wasted a shed load of money on a digital connectivity capability with your radio, which you can't use. So these are all of the things to consider, I suppose, when you're thinking about how you're going to use it. Now, license type. If you're a licensed radio operator, it won't make a lot of difference, but some of you might be aware there are two, well, there's more than two, but two main types, licensed and unlicensed. So there's a licensed free version, which is your PMR radio, and that's essentially a two-way radio, essentially an end-to-end, and it's often channelized. And that's used a lot more in the commercial world than it is in our world as such. But there are two types, and they can, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a later slide, but they can be better or worse dependent on, again, the application. So I would certainly make that as a consideration as well. What type of license you have, or what type of operator is going to use it. The other consideration, probably goes without saying, is of course power restriction. although there are claims that some of the newer radios, in fact, transmit upwards of 20 watts, but I actually saw one advertised again today for, I think it was 100 watts. How on earth they expect you to carry that around, let alone use it, is beyond me. And obviously the marketing guys there have had a little bit of a brain melt, I would think, because I can't imagine that radio actually ever working. But generally there are going to be power restrictions. Great if you're going to do QRP. If you're not wanting to be QRP and you're just looking to, make some contacts on 2 meters or something along those sort of lines, then while you're out and about, then, you might want to be thinking about the sort of power that you want to use. But obviously with the current guidelines, that's more tricky as well. So there's actually another, in fact, and that was that information from RSTB actually came out after I'd written this slide. So I ought to go back and rewrite this slide, really, going, and you've also got to now consider the other variant. But you do need to think about those things. I can't remember its name. I tried to look for it and I couldn't find it, but there was a radio that came out, I was going to say 2 years ago. No, it must be, about 2 years ago. It might be 3 years ago. I remember I was at a rally. I think it was Newark. Yeah, it was Newark. And I think it was Lynchline that was selling it, but I could be wrong. And Martin Lynch's was selling this new radio. I'm sure it was a Yaesu that actually came with its own amplifier. And it claims that it was doing then upwards of 60 watts with an amplifier attached to it. So it was essentially a radio, a handheld radio with they just had a rubber duck in the top of it, with a charging unit, and alongside went the power amplifier. I can't remember how much it was, but it wasn't cheap. About 180 quid, I think, or something along those sort of lines, which for a mobile handheld radio is a heck of a lot, since you can buy a cheap, what are they called? Bofang for a tenner or something along those lines. So it was kind of quite expensive. Again, power restrictions, what you want to do with it, really important. Duty cycle, because these things don't have a massive duty cycle. You've got to be thinking about how often you're going to use it. And the charging capabilities. You'd be surprised how many people I know will take 2 or 3 handhelds, because the chances are one will die, the other one will lose its charge, and the third one might just work when they want it to. These things have a habit of losing their charge quite quickly. So you do need to think about that, especially if you're going to be using your radio for, there's a real chance you're going to need to make contact with somebody. So there could be a precarious situation that you might find yourself in. I must tell you this, and it's an interesting twist on it. And when I was writing this slide, what I was doing partly when I was doing this was also thinking about my other job, if you like, with my other hat on, as the West Wales coordinator for 4x4 response. So the problem we've got with the 4x4 response team is we've got some guys that use CB radios to communicate with each other. We've got very, very few operators that have got a foundation license. So they just can't communicate using 2 meters or anything like that. And even if they could, we'd have to have repeaters all over the place because of the topography of the area. Our phone signals are pretty difficult here, pretty intermittent. So we're struggling with Zello work, although we use it. So while I was writing this, I was thinking, from my point of view as a emergency rescue operator, I've got an issue because no one method is going to be, absolutely foolproof, even if I've got a handheld, So I do need to think about that. So again, if you guys are thinking of getting a decent handheld, you need to be really thinking about these things. And the last bit, of course, which might not necessarily be important to you if you're not interested in this, and hopefully after my talk on it, you might be a bit more, but SDR and SDR capabilities, and some of the, again, the more modern, more recent handhelds that are available on the market right now. In fact, I think one of them was advertised in last month's Radcom, has got quite sophisticated SDR capabilities, almost as good as, well, I was going to say the Anon 4, but probably not the Anon 4, but maybe the Anon 3. So it's certainly got quite good SDR capabilities in terms of its filtering, its modulation, and all the rest of it. And of course, they come programmable as well, and make good interfacing with your, with your PC or your laptop or whatever other software you're running. I'm thinking of contests here as well. They can be quite easy to use pieces of kit. Okay, so simple slide. As I said, I'm just trying to keep this simple. I'm not going into great detail, but just simple things to think about when you are choosing your model, because there are just so many. And I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say this, although we're all in danger of doing it. Big is not always beautiful, and neither is the most expensive. One of the, I can't remember the name of it now, Woogson. My first radio, my first mobile was a Woogson. I've still got the Woogson. It's the version 1. It's probably worth about 10 quid, but it works well. It's one of the best little handhelds I've ever had. Far better than some of the other models that I've got, which now sit on the shelf. And yet its capability on paper is not as good, but it works every time. It works incredibly well. It's got a lovely audio on it, great receive circuit on it. It's a great little radio, inexpensive, So just because you want something, don't necessarily think throwing the money at it will make the difference, because it won't necessarily. Go back to this basic guide if you're not sure. So that was just a little bit about choosing one. A little bit on technical stuff, really. I borrowed this. Actually, I should have put the source on here. It was can't remember the name of the source now, but I will confess it's not mine. But I have borrowed it. But I just thought it was quite, in doing a bit of research for this and putting this together, I just thought this was quite a probably the easiest way to get this little bit of information over. So in terms of UHF and VHF capability, I just teased out some of the biggest pros for using UHF over VHF. So in built-up areas, for example, using UHF is far better. So again, you might have to think about the mode there. If you're wanting to use it in urban areas, if you want to use your radio in an urban area rather than a more rural area, such as the one I'm in at this moment. So that was some of those, I mean, you can read it for yourself, but that was some of the main things that I kind of teased out of that little read, really. A lot of the, again, and a lot of the modern sets you can buy, as it says there, have GPS capabilities as well on your radio. So again, you can do lots of direction finding activity with it. It can Wi-Fi, Bluetooth connect to your phone, to any device that's got a Bluetooth, it's got Bluetooth capability, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a lot of different applications that it will lend itself to. And again, some of the, again, doing a little bit of research, some of the modern sets now, some of the modern radios, handy radios, can do all of those things and more. Okay. So for VHF, which we're more used to, I suppose, you tend to be used on sort of longer distance communication where you're looking to hit repeaters and stuff like that, or perhaps on SOTA events, field events, those sorts of things. But again, a lot of the, in fact, 2 of the radios I've got here, even though they're handheld radios, can listen in on obviously air traffic, although I can't transmit on those frequencies, of course, because I'm not licensed to do that, but I can listen to them. And so that, there are some great capabilities out there. So again, a little bit of information. If you do want a copy of these slides, I should have said that right at the beginning, I'm quite happy to put that, to give Simon a copy so he can distribute that out to everyone if you want a copy of these, because this could be quite useful background information if you want it. And again, I wasn't sure who the audience would be for this, so I'm not trying to tell a duck how to suck eggs, but I just teased out a few things that I thought might be useful. So just going back quickly, UHF, biggest difference there is built up areas, really. That's when they come into their own. So you tend to find them in use as 2-way radios, walkie-talkies, whatever you want to call it. Whereas with VHF, where they tend to have a much longer range, much better capability. GMRS or PMRs, they can be licensed to these, and they have more of a commercial use, a public service or commercial use. So when you guys, I'm not sure if you watch things like a Handy or something and they're using it in their car and you're thinking, how on earth are they doing that? Because I don't see any antenna on the top of the car, and I certainly don't see much, internal wiring or whatever it is in their vehicle. And that's, they're probably using one of these because they're cheap, they're easy to use, they don't require a license, and they're only talking between themselves as a commercial organization, and they don't need a license to do that. Although a lot of amateurs can go on to those frequencies and operate on PMR frequencies and actually do, but sort of it's that's all I really know about. I'm not going to lie, I don't know a great deal about this because I don't use it, but that's what I found out about it. They're not so as cheap as your standard little toy walkie-talkie, but they will perform very well. As I say, they have more of a commercial use. So in a nutshell, these are commercial. These are the sorts of radios we are more used to using, and those are probably more sort of business and professional use. Then I came across this, which some of you might be aware of, but I hadn't actually heard of, but the Family Radio Service, which is basically like a walkie-talkie system, which is apparently predicated in the States to begin with. And sort of came across this, and it seemed to me to be almost like a civilized CB, where families were allowed use of it within a group of people that could be called a family. And they are regarded by a lot within a small unit of people that aren't going to communicate with the outside world only themselves. It can be an interesting activity, apparently. No license required for that either. So I'm not sure if you've come across it. I haven't, but that's what FRS is. So there's 4 groups then, really: FRS, GMRS or PMR, VHF, and UHF. And a lot of the modern radios available now, certainly the recent ones that have just come out, will operate on lots of these, if not all of them. Okay, I'll come back to that if you guys want more information or want to talk a little bit more about it. As I say, just jump in. Feel free to jump in if you've got any questions. Some pros then. I'm not saying these are the only pros. These are my pros. They're not necessarily the only pros. These are the things I found that I thought were useful. They're easy and relatively inexpensive bands. So even if you're a shortwave listener, or you just got your license, you haven't got a lot of cash, you haven't set up your home base yet, you haven't managed to put your antenna up, because let's face it, even that isn't inexpensive. It costs money and it's time, but you can buy yourself a cheap Bofang and you can listen in. And it's cheap and cheerful and easy to use. And it never ceases to amaze me why we don't make more of that as an amateur radio society, why we don't make more use of the fact that these things exist and people should, be encouraged to use them. I do remember going on one event that we had, which was in my old club, and we were running it in it was part of a town centre sort of family day thing. We managed to find some space. We were given a little space for a stall within this event, and I took along a couple of handhelds, and John was over in the corner, putting out some radio chat on 2 meters, and I was stood over the other side with a couple of handhelds. And these kids were amazed by what was happening, and they were able to use the handheld, and I could take one and I could walk around the car park with it and so on and so forth. And kids loved it. Why we don't do more of that, I just don't know. But because they're so easy and relatively inexpensive to buy. They're mobile, most of them, well, all of them are. I mean, obviously, if you're going to go for a nice brand new block with your amplifier sat alongside, maybe not so easy to take along with you, but most are mobile and they're easy to set up. And I have to say, as someone who's trying to program several radios, quite easy to program as well. I did find the Wuxen far easier to program off my PC than I ever did find my 79 or 7800, I can't remember now, 7800 I think it is, that I've got in the car, or I had in the car. I found that far easier to program. So, and most of them actually, some of them now come along already pre-programmed, so you don't even have to do that. I'm not talking DMR now, I'll come to that later on. I'm just talking standard, programming in your repeater stations, repeater settings, and so on and so forth. They can be very easy. Again, just talking about the Wuxens, and in fact the Bofang as well, to some extent, easy menus to use as well. So you can work your way through the menus. They're quite self-explanatory and quite intuitive as well. And most are pre-programmed. So I don't find them too challenging. And I will say, even though I kind of pride myself and I know, I think I know what I'm doing, even now with the 7300, there are still, I'm going to confess, there's still stuff on there I haven't even used. I don't even know what it's for. I'll find out what that's for at some point. So compared to the 7300, the menu system is far easier to use. In fact, if anybody knows it, I find the most difficult menu I've ever come across is the ASUS FT450D. It's just that is not intuitive. The menu on that is just not intuitive. Press a button here, do that, but you don't repeat that function for something else. It just doesn't make no sense. So, that's just my own opinion, but they are easy to use. Now, for those of you interested in digital activity, whether that's DMR, CE, C4FM, FT8, and all the rest of it, they can be a cheap and quick and easy way to get into digital capability. Some of the more recent models actually can now act as a hotspot as well. So they're like a mini router or a mini node controller as well, if you're into that. And they can be set up to do that function. So they can be set up so that you can communicate through it to somewhere else. They are quite, they're getting more and more and more sophisticated, to be fair. And it's kind of up there with mobile phone technology, really. It's becoming more commonplace now with that. So I've got one of the, in fact, I keep looking up here, the TYT, I can't remember the model now. I've mentioned it before. I decided I was going to try DMR. And I gave it a go. It's still sat up there gathering dust. I have apparently programmed it, but I've got no idea what I'm listening to, and I still haven't been able to find my way onto a DMR group that are active yet. So I resort to Echolink in the end, and I find Echolink just gets me what I need, onto what I need. So I've just sort of given up, really. And that's coming from somebody who quite likes this technology. So I don't find DMR very easy to understand. The language is completely different for a start. But if you do, then there are models out there for you. So that's a pro. Very easy to set up, very easy to use, apparently. Although I don't find it so. Now, one of the other things I would say, because I've actually managed to do it as well, is you can harness your handy as a mobile radio in the same way as you can a mobile amateur radio. You know, it's exactly the same. It can be harnessed in exactly the same way. So you could set up your mobile, your handy as a mobile radio in your car if you wish. But there are a few things I want to talk about in a moment, though, about you doing that. If you do, you have to be very careful, but you can do it. I have done it, and it does work very well. And in fact, before I forget to mention it, the Wookson that I've got, I ended up buying a microphone attachment to it as well. So it actually comes with its own microphone. So it can operate in a car with a microphone in the same way as you would use a mobile radio. And it doesn't operate like a handheld anymore. So they can be quite easily harnessed. And again, you can buy all the equipment for that off your suppliers or for your individual radio fairly inexpensively. So as a quick, fairly simple, fairly reasonable priced way of getting a mobile setup in a car, that's probably a good way to do it to begin with. And they can actually be quite stealth ready as well. So if you want a radio that you just want to tuck away somewhere, you don't particularly want people to well, I suppose you're going to have your antenna on the car perhaps, but apart from that, if you just wanted your radio tucked away, you didn't want anyone to see that or know it was there, if you do need to use it in some kind of stealth situation, then it does, it satisfies that function, that solution. Very quickly as well, and some would see it as a pro, but some might see it as a con actually. We went through a phase with, I think I'm right in saying this, we went through a phase with handhelds, a bit like mobile phones. They started off like that. They got smaller and smaller and smaller until if you had a handheld that size, you were the bee's knees. It got smaller and smaller. Now they're beginning to get slightly bigger and bigger again and fatter that way. But we went through a phase where they went really, really small, so you could hardly read the screen. And they fitted nicely into your pocket, so they could be quite stealth, whereas some of the later models now are getting larger and larger again. So we seem to be going through those phases. So those are the pros. Some cons then, guys, and this is again my own my own thoughts really. They're not more than that, I suppose, but there are some cheap copies, okay? And I hate to say it, but some of them do tend to be Chinese cheap copies, even of the Wooksons, in fact. I think at the time, if I remember rightly, when I got the Wookson, there were some cheap Wookson copies. And you could tell they were cheap because the lettering of the Wookson wasn't the same. You actually stacked them side by side and they looked totally different, but they were being sold as Wooksons, and they're not. They're cheap, nasty stuff. They have very poor build quality. and they are virtually toys. They really have no duty cycle whatsoever. And as for receive and transmit, you're better off with 2 tins and a piece of string, really. They're not going to do much more than that, and you've wasted your money. Some people put Bufang in that category. I don't actually. In fact, the Bufang I've got here is only, I forget what model it is now. It's only a cheapy one, but it actually works. It does all right. I don't rubbish Bufang. I think they're okay. But some can be a little bit cheap and nasty, so you do have to be careful. They've obviously got a limited power output, although I did say earlier on that, if you're looking for power, they won't deliver that, but some do have an amplifier or some have amplifier capability now. But to my mind, if you're going to amplify something like that, then you may as well spend money on a decent radio system in the first place, rather than trying to do that with a handheld. But that's just a view. They can suffer some of them can suffer quite poor receive quality. So don't expect the same receive quality on, it might sound obvious, but don't expect the same receive quality on a handheld as you're going to get on a standard rig, because you won't get that. They have very limited DPS, if any. And one of the biggest problems is that they can be overdriven by really, really strong signals. So, they can be a downside, really, if you're trying to listen in on nearby stations. You get to the point sometimes where you can only hear one of the 3 nearby stations, because the receive circuit is being so overdriven that it will, it's in danger of collapsing. So you do have to be very careful with that. And they've got limited. So in that sense, they're limited in their static capability. And even some of the later models with the SDR operation, because they've got limited screen facilities, unless you're going to use it in a static capacity, where you're going to throw the screen up on through a USB to a PAN adapter, unless you're going to do that, you're not going to be able to read very much on the screen. So again, be prepared for it to have limited but similar use. If you've got, one of my later models has got crossband capability, which should work for split work and stuff like that. And this particular one's got digital capability on it as well, but I've never been able to work it very well. I get a lot of signal blocking on it. I'm to the point where there's just continual hiss in some cases where the signals are just being blocked across each other. And because there's very limited DPS, I'm just getting nowhere with it. I end up having to turn it off. So again, you do have to be careful with that, because you're dealing with a much smaller system, if you like, then it will suffer. So there are limited capabilities. That's what I'm really saying there. Limited in transmit as well. Now, I do want to say this, that I have successfully used my handheld. I forget which one it was now. I'm looking at it, trying to remember. I think it was the original Wuxen. I managed to find a connector system that would allow me to switch into it a standard HF antenna. So I could, or VHF antenna, sorry. I could actually listen to it on a VHF antenna. But be very careful, because you will overdrive the PA. You will certainly overdrive the receive circuit, because it's not used to receiving signals of that magnitude. It's used to receiving signals through a rubber duct, not through, a 6-element Yagi or something like that. It will suffer it. For short periods, it's okay, but for long periods, your duty cycle will just go through the bin. So be very, very careful, but you can use it that way. So if going back to the car, if you've got one in the car and you've harnessed it, you could use a magnet of some sort, or a 2-meter antenna on your car, and you could probably get away with that, depending on how much you were going to use it. But so I have done that, and it does work very well, but just be careful if you're connecting a standard antenna system to it. And in fact, you might have an override circuit. So if it is overridden, chances are it will close itself down. And obviously the other biggest problem is the charge, because the more you use it, the more you lose the charge, unless it's on a standard charge all the time. So if you're running it in the car, yes, you can be charging and using, but again, if you're in the field, that's unlikely unless you're going to be taking lots of battery packs with you. And I don't know about anybody else, but taking battery packs is an absolute, it is a nightmare. It's a very difficult thing to do. They're heavy quite often, and it's hard work. So, again, and even with QRP work, they don't have a great deal of shelf life. So just be aware of that. They're great for what they're designed for, which is just one-to-one communication, very short distances and stuff like that. And they're that type of communication tool. But any more than that, they will be limited. So those were just a few cons that I'd come across having tried these things out. Okay. So a few tips on that I sort of managed to come up with on connecting or getting the best out of your particular radio. So this was just some of my bits of advice, really. Keep it simple. Some of the more complex radios, yes, they have got more functionality, but that comes at a price, and usually it's probably in terms of selectivity and responsiveness of your radio. They've got to compromise somewhere, because otherwise your handheld radio becomes your home-based radio again. So unless it's completely SDR, in which case, yeah, they get smaller and smaller, but even that is limited in what it can do. So I would just suggest you keep it simple. If it's just 2-meter activity you want, that's all you're looking for, a cheap 2-meter radio, really, that will give you that facility. Don't go for any more, because there's no need, you're not going to use it. Keep the radio charged, obviously. Have a backup. Some of the newer radios actually got a power default on it, so it will reduce your power output if the battery runs low. Anyway, you won't get a choice. You think you're sort of putting 3 or 4 watts, you're not, you're putting 1.5 watts, if that. It will just reduce it down, so keep your eye on that. Be very careful with that. Can't read the other bit because you're in the way. Let me get you the way. There you go. A lot of we had. Oops, sorry. Hang on. Go. Yeah. Right, sorry about that. We had in the old club. We had a spate of youngsters come in to do their foundation license. I think they were, from memory, they were a Land Rover group. I'm sure they were sort of in the mid-20s, something like that. And all they wanted to do was go out in the car park and play about with the handers. When you get to the bit on the foundation license where you have to make a first contact, So all they wanted to do was go out and play with these things. And they were talking, like this, and nobody could hear a word, because they just spoke so quickly through them. They didn't have enough of that modulation process, just couldn't cope with the amount of noise it was hearing, and it just became mush. That's common anyway for new operators who might be a little bit mic shy. Perhaps they're not so sure of what they're doing, but particularly with a handheld, because of the reactiveness and the responsiveness of the modulation circuit is not as good as it might be with other radios. So you have to play to that when you're trying to speak into it. Keep it simple, keep it clear so on and so forth. For what it's worth, I've had to work quite hard with going back to the 4x4 guys, I've had to work quite hard with them to try to get them to understand radio language, communication on air. Even if they're using cello works, we have to do that with them because they start having conversations with each other. This is not a conversation you're having, this is a communication you're making, and so on and so forth. If you're going to use digital capability with your handheld, so you want to use it for a contest, so you want to go out and work up on a hill, you want to go out and work mobile, you want to use it for RDF, you want to log your contacts, you want to log your RDF contacts, you want to log your locations, even for geocaching and stuff like that. If you're into that and you're logging the caches and so on and so forth, then you're going to want something that's going to work with your laptop, or actually something that's going to work with your mobile phone, because mobile phones have login software on them, so you can work through the mobile phone to handheld, okay, through a USB connector. You have to think about the compatibility of the software. The last thing you want to find is that you've got to reprogram your handheld to work with your mobile phone or your laptop, and therefore you lose all the repeater settings in doing so. And then you have to go back and put the repeater settings in. And if you try to do that manually, it will take you hours. I'm not joking, it will take you hours. So you don't want to be doing that. So it's something you need to check out. And some of the digital programming software that you can get for your handhelds can be quite expensive as well. So again, it might be a cost effectiveness thing. Do you really want to do that? Spend the money on that for your handheld when there might be a better solution. All right. So again, probably not worth it if you're going to be spending lots of money on it. So again, you need to make those sorts of choices. I also said about connecting to a static antenna system, not saying don't do it, but just remember that the signals that are being received are much stronger than the radio was designed for. So you do need to be consider that. Your circuits are going to in your handheld are going to be used to far less loading than they're getting. So better to think about your location rather than just throwing up your standard antenna. Can you move? Can you go to a better location? Could you think about near objects that you might be struggling to get past or through? A clear line of sight, those sorts of obvious things, but you might need to be thinking about that. I can remember I was doing a Rainet weekends runners somewhere, I can't remember where, I don't think it was here, it was back in Bristol. And I was on checkpoint 5, which was right on the bend of behind a field and right underneath a power line. It was just hopeless. I couldn't hear a thing. Every time somebody was trying to tell me there was a bunch of runners on their way to me, I just got literally, it was a bit like really just hopeless. And so I ended up having to, move so that I could just, make the thing work. So I know it seems obvious, but they just don't work everywhere. And in this case, I was just using a standard rubber duct. It might be worth me talking because I've just remembered that I hadn't put that on the slide, although it is on the last point a little bit that I make there about homebrew antennas. There are, by the way, a lot of replacement antennas for your handheld on the market. Again, there is as many replacement handheld antennas as there are mobile units themselves. And although, for example, you probably heard of them, one of my favorites, of course, is Sandpiper. They produce a lovely range of handheld antennas. Some of them have fantastic gain reports. Put this mobile this rubber, slightly longer rubber duck into your mobile, and you will get, you know, extraordinary gain figures. Next to rubbish. That's not going to happen. You know, the only time that's going to happen is if you've got a static antenna into it, a standard antenna into it, or you're, as I am here, probably, you know, 2,500 feet above sea level or something daft like that. It's not going to happen. You know, the capability of your radio is close communication. So I also got done, because the first time I bought, I mean, I'm talking from experience because I got sucked in. I read this report of this wonderful antenna, forget what it was called. It was one of these Yaesu antennas, I think, and it wasn't. It was actually a cheap Chinese copy that arrived. I thought it was a bit odd because it was about £8 for this wonderful new antenna that was going to improve my handhelds. You know, I plugged it in and it was worse than the original one. It was actually worse than the standard antenna it came with. And it went straight in the bin. Literally went straight in the bin. I don't think I kept it. So they don't work incredibly well. The only one that I do recommend is, and I forgot the name of it, but it looks a bit like a car aerial. It's an extendable aerial. Comes in 4 sections, and I think that's a Yaesu one as well, if from memory serves me correct. That one does seem to work a little better. It certainly improves the receive a little more, but they don't have to make your radio quite heavy, because you've got a little sort of mobile handheld like that and an antenna that's kind of that long, and you're walking about with a fishing pole, you know, prodding people as you walk about, poking their eye out and stuff like that. So do be careful with it. The last point I want to make is about home brews. Now, I was going to take a photo of it, but I haven't been able to do that. In fact, I've actually got to find it. It's out in the workshop. So I'll promise that I will take a photo of it, and I'll put it on the Facebook page or something like that for the club. But I've made a few of these little 2-meter halo antennas. They're so cheap to make. This one I made, well, I made several, but the last one cost me about £20. That included the copper pipe. They're so easy and cheap to make, but they work very well. They don't seem to overdrive the PA, and they don't overdrive receive circuitry either. It works very well, and it's quite directional. So good for RDF work. If you're out on pedestrian, for example, fox hunts, and you're using a little mobile radio there, you know, most people I was with would put their little handheld like this and then start turning around to direct the signal. And now I'm just twisting this thing around in the air to find them. That works very, very well. Another lad who was in the same club, he made one out of a few old tape measures. So he made a little Yagi out of 4 tape measures. That also worked quite well, but looked a bit cumbersome to move around. So it was just walking around with this little pole with a Yagi on with a little rubber end to it. And he was just sort of walking about, turning it like this as he was going down the high street. Great fun, and you can make them. They're quite inexpensive to make, and they do work very, very well. And they don't seem to overdrive anything, whereas your standard 2-meter antenna Yagi will. So I found that very, very good. So this little halo antenna, very easy to make out a little cheap bit of copper pipe. Great way to get a little bit more, shall we say, out of your handheld, other than using the rubber duck. But don't be fooled into buying, you know, these wonderful brand new antennas that they advertise will do everything for you. They don't generally. You know, a handheld is a handheld. But as I said, the halos do work. So that was just some of my experiences of that. Okay. Now, why won't that move on? That's interesting. Bear with me. For some reason it won't. There we go. So that's it, really. That was all I wanted to say. Now, I was going to very short tonight, I know, but I was going to then say, right, okay, over to you guys. If you've got any questions or anything you want to ask about a mobile you've got or handheld you've got, sorry, or share about your experiences of using them, you can do. Please do so. If you've got any burning questions that you would like an answer to, but you don't particularly want to put it on here or to share publicly, feel free to PM me, or feel free to just privately message me in the chat box, and I'm more than happy to come back to you that way. But that's all I wanted to say. So essentially, in summary then, I was going to say literally thousands, but probably not thousands, but certainly in the hundreds, there are many, many, many different types, many different modes, many different operating characteristics. You just need to use that little checklist to check the one that you think is going to suit you best. You do get into a habit, I did with mine, I don't take it so much now, but you do tend to take it most places with you. I used to take it in the car with me, I was in here waiting to go into the new car, but even when you've got your standard 2-meter radio in your car or your 77-meter radio in the car, I still used to take it with me, throw it on the back seat or throw it on the passenger seat, because you never know. I always used to think to myself, I'm going to be broken down somewhere, and the bloody radio in the car doesn't work. There's a chance that I might be able to go out, walk out somewhere, walk up some high ground, if there's some high ground somewhere or other, and see if I can get a signal out, if your handheld works. So it is a little bit of a safety device. The other thing I used to do quite a lot is use it in hotels when I'm working away. And that's a good thing about the Halo. Just sling the Halo antenna out the window of the hotel. Apart from Premier Inns, because their bloody windows don't open the right way. They open at the bottom. So you have to sort of shove it out the window and push it up. But windows that open normally, stick your Halo antenna out, bung it into the end of your mobile radio, and you've got a 2-meter setup in your hotel room. It works great. So I've used it that way as well. I've enjoyed that. So there's lots of different ways of using them. But that's just my experiences of it. So thank you very much, guys. That's it for now. Any questions? Over to you.
What about batteries and the different types of batteries? Obviously, the older batteries were quite heavy. You can get the polymer batteries nowadays that are quite light. So to me, a handheld should be a simple thing. All I need it for is to talking to people. I don't need any fancy gizmos on it. Although inevitably with technology, they chuck a whole load of stuff at it. But what about modern handhelds? What batteries are they now using? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I mean, I know that they are using certainly the ones here have got quite a good lifespan. In other words, if I do a good charge on it, it will stay charged for, depending on how much I'm using it, it'll stay charged for at least 2, maybe 3 days, something like that. So it's got quite a good charge on it, but it does depend on how much you use it. I think the standard lithium batteries, I'm not sure exactly of the make, but they have got smaller and smaller as time goes on, absolutely. But I mean, I would certainly, I'd certainly recommend going for a good quality battery. Perhaps I should have added that to my list, really, as a consideration, rather than not necessarily doing that, because obviously your battery life is really important, and unless you're in a position when you're operating mobile where you can recharge it quickly, then you're going to be really really in trouble with that. But I'm sorry I can't answer it directly, but I'm pretty sure that the batteries that I've got here I've got quite a good life